The things that I love and hold dear to my heart are just borrowed and not mine at all. Jesus only let me use them to brighten my life. So remind me, dear Lord. Roll back the curtain a little now and then. Show me where you brought me from and where I could have been. Remember, I'm human and you must forget. So remind me, dear Lord. Nothing good have I done to deserve God's own Son. I'm not worthy of the scars in His hands. Yet He chose the road to Calvary to die in my stead. Why He loved me, I can't understand. Roll back the curtain a memory now and then. Show me where you brought me from and where I could have been. Remember, I'm human and you must forget. So remind me, dear Lord. 304. Sing the first and the last verse, and then we'll have our Bible class. There's a beautiful place called heaven. It's hidden above the bright blue, where the new times are live in love and eternity through. Above the bright blue, the beautiful blue, Jesus is waiting for me and you want to be opening your Bibles up, open up to 2 Corinthians.
I liked your lesson you gave Sunday night. I went home and today I opened my Bible up and I read about little chapters.
That's good.
This is
Excellent. All right, we're talking about being full and complete in Christ. What this has to do with is just our learning what it means to be mature, to grow up, and to find our fullness and to find our completeness in Jesus. And we're using several different passages to kind of make the point that, our struggles that we have today are struggles that they had in the first century. And so we're not that different as far as the nature of men goes. We're not that different from those folks in the first century. We're a little more modernized, but the issues and the struggles and difficulties and opportunities all remain the same for us. So we can grow and we can mature, but it requires our giving ourselves over completely to Christ. Now in 2 Corinthians, did I tell you the chapter? Okay, no, well, just any chapter. We can pick out whichever one. We're going to use the last two verses of chapter 5, all of chapter 6, and the first verse of chapter 7. All right, so now that's thoroughly confused everybody, so I think it's verse 20 of chapter 5. Now this is 2 Corinthians. Make sure you're in 2 Corinthians. Corinth, we know Corinth had struggles and issues. We understand that, and we've talked about their problem primarily being that they were just all over the place. They really they couldn't get together on anything. And because of their divisions that existed among them, they had a lot of questions in 1 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians, Paul kind of answers some of the issues that he addressed in the first letter. Also, he has a task in 2 Corinthians of defending his ministry. And, we think that wouldn't be difficult for him to do, and yet there were many challenges to his ministry that people had everywhere. Even people in the church sometimes challenged his ministry. So you have to understand a little bit about Corinth. Corinth was a very wealthy city. In fact, in the first century, it would have been considered a very modern city. It was at the crossroads of a couple of major trade routes, and it seemed like all the roads, no matter where they were, led somehow to Corinth. And when I say roads, I'm not talking about physical highways like we're thinking about, but I mean even trade routes. They all seemed to converge at Corinth. It was a very, very wealthy city. It was a city during these days of somewhere around 1.5 to 2 million people lived there. And I don't know if you ever looked at a map to see where Corinth is. Lane and I and the kids had an opportunity to go to Corinth several years ago. When one of our trips out of Russia, we went to Greece and we went to Athens and we rented a van one day and we drove down to Corinth. Corinth is kind of out on this little peninsula. It's just a stretch of land, and at the end of it is the city. Today it's only about 15,000 or so. Very small city today, very insignificant city today. But in those days it was very important. And everybody seemed like they came there. It was very wealthy. They had very loose morals in that city. Their intellectual pride is what really was at the root of most of the troubles in the Corinthian church. There were some people, we read that and says, some of you say I'm of Paul, and some say I'm of Apollos, and some say I'm of Cephas or Peter, and some of you say I'm of Christ and all. Well, the reason for that is because when Paul preached, as best we can determine from his writings and seeing some of the sermons that he delivered, Paul was a very simple preacher. He didn't use big fancy words. He did not need to. He could have. He was very educated. But he didn't use very difficult or challenging words or phrases in his speech. He talked very simply about the gospel and about preaching. Apollos, on the other hand, was more of a polished speaker. And Apollos would use more of a flair, you might say. I mean, it's like people today. We hear different preachers today, and some of them are very simple and down to earth, and some of them are a little bit up here, and some of them even may get up here, where they kind of go over our heads because of the words they use and things like that. Well, that was one of the divisions that existed among them. That's why some of them were saying, I'm following this guy, I'm following this guy, and so on and so forth. So that was an issue. Some preferred Paul's simple style, and some didn't. Basically, in a nutshell, to say that. There was strife between those who fought for freedom in Christ. They thought that perhaps that meant that they could do anything they wanted to do. Some of these taboo things that were going on in the city of Corinth with their loose morals there. They had many temples dedicated to some of the Grecian or Roman gods. There were temple prostitutes in many of them, a very immoral type of worship that they engaged in those. And then there were those who were of the church, and they didn't do those things. And Paul talked about liberation being in Christ and certainly being found in the gospel. But many of them thought that, about their immorality, especially their sexual immorality, and even it extended to foods that they would eat, that they thought they could do just about anything they wanted to. There were some who felt that the Jewish traditions and other rules that they had grown up with needed to be kept very strictly. So Paul addressed in 1 Corinthians, he addressed eating of the food or the meat that had been offered to idols. Well, for somebody who's full grown and somebody who understands, Paul said basically there's nothing in the meat. Meat is just meat, that's all it is. But there may be some who are weaker in the faith who have an issue with that. And so Paul said, if it's something that I can control, in other words, I will not be responsible for causing somebody else to stumble. So if I don't need to eat meat, then I won't eat meat. And that's basically what it boils down to. So you had these people that were just all over the place. Some thought you could do anything, some thought you needed to be real strict and tight with the rules and things of that nature. And there was jealousy that existed among the Corinthian brethren because many of them had evidently some sort of spiritual gift. Now, not all of them had it, but many of them did. And so there was some jealousy among them in the way they would do that. And we read 1 Corinthians 14, verse 40, and it tells us that all things should be done decently and in order. And we use that sometimes a little bit out of context because we think, well, if Tony got up today and led 4 songs, and next week he got up and led 7, Tony needs to be reprimanded because he led too many songs. And that's not decent, and that's not in order, and that messes up everything else that we're doing, and so on. That's not what the verse was intended for. If you read that verse, it starts in chapter 13, and maybe back even part of it in chapter 12, but it goes on for a couple of chapters there where Paul talks about spiritual gifts. And what the Corinthians were doing was they were so jealous of each other, they were trying to outdo one another with their spiritual gifts. And so somebody who had the gift of speaking in tongues, which was nothing more than a foreign language, and I want you to understand that it wasn't jibber-jabber that people offer up today and say, I'm speaking in tongues. You're not speaking in tongues, you're speaking gibberish. That's all it is. You've let your emotions overwhelm you. And I don't mean to say that to offend anybody. I'm just telling you, tongues, when it's used in the New Testament, refers to a foreign language. So most of these people would have been speaking Greek, or most of them would have been speaking Hebrew. They wouldn't have been speaking anything else. It'd be just like somebody coming in here today and preaching you a sermon in Italian. What would you benefit from that? Any of us. I don't speak Italian. Maybe some of you do. I may be unaware of that. But there would be no benefit. So the ones who are speaking in tongues, many times that's what they would do. They would stand up and they would give this big long spiel in their foreign language, and there was nobody there to translate it for them. Nobody there to say, here's what's being said. So there was a lot of jealousy that existed among them. So Paul had that task to deal with, and he wanted to cause them to understand that they didn't need to allow that jealousy to get out of control. There was also a problem that existed between those who were rich and those who were poor. And there was a conflict there between them. So Paul addressed most of that in 1 Corinthians, but in 2 Corinthians he had to deal with some of it still. And in 2 Corinthians especially, he had to address his ministry and the gospel that he preached. There were some people in Corinth who were impugning, would be the right word. They were speaking bad about Paul's ministry. That maybe he didn't have the authority that he claimed to have, and so on. And so they would question his motives, they would question his credentials, they would question a lot of things that he was doing, and so he took some time in 2 Corinthians to defend that a little bit. So the attacks against him basically boiled down to this. They challenged and presented a problem for the effectiveness of his preaching. His preaching wasn't as effective because there were those who were saying these bad things about him. So back in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16, Paul urged them to imitate me. And he reiterates the same thing in 2 Corinthians. He emphasizes that his life, his ministry, and his message were all worthy of imitation. Because as far as Paul was concerned, and what he wanted them to understand is all of those things were a demonstration of the grace, the wisdom, and the power of God working through Paul. And he wanted them to know that. He wanted them to understand that. So it was a matter of spiritual health and spiritual welfare for the Corinthian brethren, to put aside these divisions, to put aside these jealousies, to put aside these challenges to his ministry, and focus on what the gospel really was all about. And I think today we're not too far away from that today. That same idea, or that same things we experience today, the cultural and religious philosophies that exist in our world are the same as existed in their world. Things they struggle with, we struggle with as well. We have that same challenge put before us. And those things all threaten our faith. They threaten to weaken our faith. And this is where we pick up in trying to understand what is it that will strengthen our own spiritual health and our own spiritual welfare as we grow or try to grow deeper in Christ. What is it? So beginning in verse 20, actually verses 20 and 21, it's just kind of a summary of the gospel and its logic, and of Paul's ministry as an apostle for the gospel. Christ, the only entirely righteous one to have ever walked this earth, at Calvary, did something that no one else could do. He took upon himself our sin. Now, I know we say this all the time, but I think a lot of times we don't quite fully understand or quite fully comprehend. That sin was deserved by us. It belonged to us. And in these two verses, he said that he who knew no sin was made sin. And that means he took it on himself, that we might be the righteousness of God. So he's kind of taken the gospel and he's just summing it all up in two verses as we have it, to say this is what I'm preaching, this is what you need to understand, this is where your focus needs to be, because this is where your faith is founded, in this very fact and this very idea. All of this is God's doing. It's not our doing. It wasn't Paul's doing. It was all God's doing. So then he goes on, and the thought continues over into chapter 6. So in chapter 6 he says, we then, and we then what? Well, we're talking about the gospel here in these last two verses. We then, as fellow workers, with him, beseech you that you receive not the grace of God in vain. Well, I think there is, I believe it's the American Standard Version that probably renders this particular verse better than any other, because it makes it very clear. It says, and working together with him, we entreat you. We're begging you. And that's the idea that should be presented. With him means God. We are working together with God, and we're encouraging you to see that and understand that as well. We see that. He said it back in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 9. He said we are God's fellow workers. And that just shows that the concept was consistent for Paul. It was a constant in his preaching and in his message. We're working together with God. You can follow us. You can imitate us. You can do what we're doing because we're concerned about how we present the gospel to you. And then at the end of that, he says, don't receive it in vain. He's thinking in terms, I believe, he's thinking in terms of the judgment seat. When we stand before God, because we know that the works of every Christian, back in chapter 5, verse 10 of 2 Corinthians, what did he say? We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. And we know that all our works are going to be brought into that moment as we stand before that judgment seat. So for them to receive the grace of God in vain meant that what they were practicing didn't measure up to what it should be. So they weren't doing the things that they needed to do. And we run, as I said, we run the same danger today. Their lives were so inconsistent because they were all over the place. With every thought, every question, every idea, they were all over the place. They were not together on anything. And Paul was trying to encourage them to be one. Be of one mind, be of one thought, be of one purpose, be of one heart. Focus on being together in all these things. But they were so inconsistent in what they were doing that it made it very difficult for them to accept this and to understand this. So Paul was trying to encourage them and get them to see, back in verse 15 of chapter 5, when he talks about this, that they might no longer live to themselves, but rather live to his glory. That's what he wanted them to understand about this. So, as we continue with this, notice how would they fail, or how would they show that they had failed to profit from this grace? I mean, it's given to us here in the text. By refusing to purify themselves from everything that contaminated the body and everything that contaminated the spirit, allowing a great divide to exist between their faith and their conduct. Because those two weren't always the same. And Paul was stressing that to them, or in some cases, perhaps, they were even trying to embrace a different gospel, something that was foreign or contrary to this. So Paul's trying to emphasize the seriousness of this and the urgency of this, and he's trying to highlight the privilege of this present danger. And he quotes Isaiah 49, verse 8. And then he applies that passage to the age of grace, because they were living under the age of grace. And he's trying to apply it to that. So in verse 3 then, he says, we put no stumbling block in anyone's path. We did not want to do that. The Greek word that's put there, and Paul was very concerned that he live a great life of example. He was very concerned about that. But the Greek word is translated there at the end of that verse. So our ministry be not blamed. The word there means to be discredited. And I want you to think about this. It conveys the idea of mocking and ridicule. There was a Greek god who was named Momus. And we don't ever hear about this Greek god in particular. But it's from the same root word that he uses here about blamed or discredited. Now, Momus was the god of mockery and ridicule. Now, you see where Paul's going with this. He's saying, or suggesting perhaps, that the thought of these Christians being made fun of or being a laughingstock because their faith and their conduct were this far apart. So that on Sundays, they were right where they needed to be, right in the pews. But on Mondays, through Friday or even through Saturday, they were doing whatever they wanted to do. Now, what does that cause people to do? It causes them not to believe very strongly in your faith. Causes them to make fun of you, mock you, and ridicule you, because you're not what you proclaim over here. Well, I'm a Christian and I do these things, so and so, and then people see you out doing something that's quite contrary to that. So they say, well, you know. So that's where this idea came from. So when you read that word blamed there, read that as discredited and understand that it involves being mocked and ridiculed because the two don't match. Your faith and your conduct, they just don't match. Paul commends himself. This really goes all the way through verse 10, I think, but he commends himself in his ministry because the gospel was a matter of actions, not words. It was a matter of doing and being what you were supposed to be. And he describes the extent to which he tried to live his life with integrity and without any fakeness or without any pretense of anything else. He wanted them to understand that he had great integrity where his faith was concerned and the way he lived his life. And he lived it all for Jesus. It was not for any other person. It wasn't for himself. It wasn't for anybody else. He lived it for Jesus. That was a great concern of him. And he displayed that without anything artificial at all in his life. In other words, when you saw Paul, that's what you got. Paul he didn't put on airs. He didn't try to do anything in a different way. And it challenges, I think, every serious reader of the Bible to examine, or maybe better said, to re-examine our lives as we stand before God and the relationship that we have with God. And also to re-examine whether our professed faith and our actual conduct are this far apart or whether they're right together, whether we demonstrate that. And Paul lived his life with a single-minded purpose, and that was to do what Christ wanted him to do. That was it. He lived for Christ. And that's very important for us. So Paul says in verse 11, he says, we've spoken freely to you, and we want you to open up your hearts. O you Corinthians, our mouth is open, and our heart is enlarged. And he wanted them to do that same thing. Wanted them to open their hearts up, and wanted them to understand the things that he was saying, the affection that he had for Christ, and the affection that he was trying to portray to them, that they would live their lives this way. Some of them apparently had an uneasy conscience about the things they were continuing to do. And remember, many of them had come out of pagan religions. And some of them were kind of trying to hang on to part of that. And it's understandable. It's very difficult to pluck someone from the world and throw them immediately into the church and expect them to get it all. They don't understand it all. they have to be taught, and they have to be taught to mature and to grow. So some of these Christians were apparently had a little bit of a problem of conscience with the pagan things that they were apparently trying to hang on to still, at least some of them, maybe not all of them, but at least some of them. So then Paul talks to them in verse 14 about being not yoked together with unbelievers. It's a fascinating study. It goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 10. That it literally was prohibited under the law of Moses to yoke together an ox and a donkey. It was prohibited. And obvious reasons. The ox is much stronger and would obviously do much more of the work and carry much more of the load and get more of the praise in the process. The donkey couldn't. Now, the reason they would yoke the donkey to the ox is to kind of train the donkey. That was the purpose of it. But it was prohibited under the law of Moses. Again, it was all done for the benefit of the donkey. That the strength of the ox could be used as they worked together, and the ox's health was going to be fine, but the health of the donkey would be put in danger because he's working with a much larger and much more powerful, stronger animal. So when he says this, don't be yoked together with unbelievers, in verse 14 of chapter 6, he says essentially the same thing in verse 1 of chapter 7. When he tells them, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. What happens when you form a relationship with someone, whether it's temporary or permanent? When you form a relationship with somebody who is an unbeliever, what happens? What would tend to happen? You most likely would have to, at some point, compromise your Christian principles. At some point. At some point, you're going to have to bend just a little bit, if not a whole lot. That would put in jeopardy your ability to stand, as your professed faith says, and what your actual conduct is. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand what this is saying here, because Paul is talking about any kind of joint participation. Sometimes it's formal, sometimes it's informal, that significantly would form your own identity. People would begin to see you as this. He's not talking about passive things, or he's not talking about working with someone to help a good moral cause or something like that. He's not talking about that. He's talking about when you literally join yourselves together, you ally yourself together with this individual who is an unbeliever. It creates great problems for you. Determining whether you're yoked together with an unbeliever is at best a judgment call. You have to make that determination. I have heard some folks that have applied it to marriages. I'm not exactly sure that that's the express purpose of this. It certainly fits, but I want you to understand also that there's a realization on the part of many of the first century writers that there are going to be marriages that exist between believers and non-believers. And he himself talks about the fact that a believing wife may very well persuade her unbelieving husband. So I think it was understood that sort of thing happens. So that's why I say this. It's an Old Testament principle that is adapted by Paul here and applied by him to emphasize the fact that it is just not in our best interest to join ourselves or ally ourselves together with an unbeliever. We'd be better off to ally ourselves with another believer. And that way we can get things done. Now, think about, we talked about marriage a little bit. Think about what existed, and we don't have anything today that's even close to it. You think about those non-Christians who were eating meat that was offered to idols. And then the Christians who came along were offered that meat that had been offered to idols. Now, when you join yourself together with that person who believes one way, somebody is going to have a stronger personality. Somebody's going to have a stronger will, and pretty soon, you will most likely have to compromise where you stand on certain issues. So a true Christian partnership is what exists between genuine yoke fellows. Paul said that in another place as well. And it can apply only to those who are already one in Christ. So again, I don't assume that he's condemning all contact. That's certainly not what he's doing. That would be more or less isolating ourselves from everyone. And back in 1 Corinthians, he talked about this, didn't he? Where he said that in order to separate ourselves from everybody, we'd have to go out of this world. And we can't go out of this world. We're in this world. We're just not supposed to be of this world. So he's not condemning everything, or we shouldn't conclude that he's condemning all contact. He's just simply saying Christian harmony cannot be expected to flourish, and Christian consistency cannot be put in jeopardy when we yoke ourselves together with an unbeliever. So and I said at best, it's a judgment call. He mentions down in, what is this verse? Well, the end of verse 14 on into 15, chapter 15, verse 15 rather, he talks about Belial. Belial is a Hebrew expression. The word literally means worthless. That's what it literally means. It's used later on in Jewish writings to talk about the devil himself. And that seems to be the way Paul used it here, to talk about the devil himself. There can be no going back, there can be no compromise with the idolatry that they have left, supposedly, for the gospel. No compromise. You have to walk away from that. So, why are Christians to come out and be separate? Number one, their identity as the church is important. He deals with that in verses 14, 15, 16, chapter 6. Why are Christians to come out and be separate? The history of redemption. And that's in the latter part of verse 16 and goes all the way through verse 18. So Paul admonishes them sort of in a negative sense. I mean, in other words, he's trying to approach this from the negative side. Don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, but in view of the absolute working together that we are to do in God's kingdom, we need to understand that we cannot be yoked with anybody who's going to be playing around with Belial or with Satan. We have to be aware of that. Let's see. Verse 1 of chapter 7, we'll kind of wrap this up. It's a logical consequence in Paul's mind. Having therefore these promises. He's kind of drawing a conclusion here from what he's just been saying. That's why I say sometimes don't take one verse and use it, because sometimes we'll pull it out of context. Keep it in context. This section, chapter 6, as we have it, would have been better if it had started in verse 20 of chapter 5 and gone through verse 1 of chapter 7. That should be chapter 6, because that's one whole topic that he deals with. So when he gets to the end, and that's the conclusion in verse 1 of chapter 7, where he says, so since we have these promises, let's do this. And he tells them that we need to, in everything that we are and everything that we do, we need to purify ourselves, cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit. And that's the word for us. So we have to recover our sense of the history of redemption. We need to understand the significance of it, what Christ honestly did for us. And we need to understand along with that the church's place in that process, within God's saving purposes and plans. He didn't intend for us just to take advantage of Jesus' death on the cross. He intended for us, when we receive that salvation, to be in the church. And we have to understand the significance of being in the church. Second thing here, how can we begin to recover and respond to what Paul says? We have to recover our understanding of the church as a peculiar people. It doesn't mean we're weirdos. It means we are a unique people. And what makes us unique? The fact that we are not supposed to be, and understand how I'm saying this, we are not supposed to be like the world. We live here. There are certain things in this world we have to do because we live here. But make the distinction between in it and of it. We don't have to be of the world. So we need to recover our understanding of what that means for the church to be this peculiar people. And then finally, we have to recover sort of a focus that exalts the sufficiency of God in all things that we do and all things that we say within the church. Now, if we have that, we'll be able pretty well in our world to make this application that Paul was making to those in the first century and what they were struggling with. I gave you a handout. This is what you can discover about God in this text. God has called us out of this world. He's called us to be separate, to be pure, to be holy. He's called us into a relationship with Him by His grace, giving us His presence, calling us fellow workers, calling us His children, calling us the temple in which He dwells. God cannot have a relationship with anything that's wicked or anything that's dark or anything that's unbelieving or anything that's worthless, Belial, or the devil, and He cannot have anything to do with idolatry. His promises give us what we need to live out the relationship that He holds for us. And then the second part there, and again, you have this, so I won't read it all to you, but I do think we need to see the urgency of allowing ourselves to be different and unique in this world. What does this look like? What is a challenge for you? Challenge for you to look at what God's doing and base your life on that. Anybody have a question or comment or anything? Again, this is all about maturity. That's all it is. It's about maturity and helping us to grow up in the fullness of God. We picked a song, number 17. We'll sing the first and the last verse of that. If you have a need of responding to the invitation tonight, we encourage you to let that be known to us. If your need is baptism or if your need is for our prayers, we encourage you to come if you would. I'll ask you to stand if you'd like. And you come as we're singing this song. Almost persuaded now to believe, almost persuaded Christ to receive. Seems now some soul to say, go Spirit, go thy way. Some more convenient day on thee I'll call. Almost persuaded, our best is past. Almost persuaded, doom comes at last. Almost cannot make. I thank you all for coming.